Hello everyone, welcome back. Today I'm going to be showing you how I use paper that is not 100% cotton. I recently posted a video about some of my favorite papers and sketchbooks, and pretty much all of them are 100% cotton. But I did mention a few brands that are cheaper, cellulose, so not 100% cotton, and they have their own uses in my mind. Over the years making YouTube videos, I have heard every comment under the sun about what type of paper is better, 100% cotton or not. And I just want to say it's way more important in how you use the paper. And I also think it's more important to use materials you have and not waste paper. Whether you have really nice paper and you're afraid to use it because you don't want to mess up on your nice stuff, or you only can afford the lower quality paper. So much about learning watercolor is about repetition, and you can learn how to use a cheap paper in a pleasing way, in a way that you enjoy, in a way that gives you good results. Today I'm going to be using fluid watercolor paper. I actually brought this with me to Scotland from America when I moved here many years ago. It's the 8 by 20 inch size. I don't even know if they sell this anymore, but I've been working on painting a little bit larger in the studio, and I love long horizontal formats like this. So anyways, we're going to use this paper, but I think I'll also demonstrate a couple things on my other dollar roundie paper, which is also not 100% cotton, and kind of share some tips and techniques that I like to use and how I approach using paper like this.
As a quick intro to this topic, if you aren't familiar with paper types, there's two main types of watercolor paper. One is made with cellulose fibers and the other is made with cotton content. So when we say 100% cotton, we mean that it contains cotton. Otherwise, it doesn't. And this is an oversimplification for sure, but one way you can think about it is that the cellulose paper is almost like a piece of wood that you're pouring water onto, whereas the 100% cotton paper is more like a cotton t-shirt that you pour water on top of. Think about how the water will sort of slide across the surface of the wood and it'll soak in a little bit and the wood will get wet, but it's much less than a t-shirt, which soaks up tons of water. Now, obviously, paper is much more nuanced, and there are ways that the manufacturers will treat the paper. Sometimes you'll read about the sizing of the paper, not in how big it is, but how the paper is treated. So it'll be internally sized and externally sized, meaning they treat it with something that allows the paint to either absorb or not and interact in a different way with the fibers. Okay, with that little lesson out of the way, let's talk about some of the challenges we face when using cellulose papers. One of the biggest struggles I have with this type of paper is the absorbency, or lack thereof, especially when doing large, really wet washes. With cotton paper, you can spread a ton of water around and it starts to absorb, and you can still push it and play with it for quite a long time. With cellulose paper, you can get a ton of water on there and it sort of sits on the surface a lot more than it does with cotton paper. And in some ways that can come in handy because you are able to play with the paint on the surface a little bit more before it soaks in. However, that leads to the next challenge, especially when doing large gradients or large areas of color. So because the paint doesn't soak in the same way, it kind of sits on the surface, it oftentimes reveals our brush strokes a lot more than it would with cotton paper. And it can even lead to a lot of streakiness. So our brush strokes are pushing the paint around, and because the paint isn't soaking in smoothly and spreading evenly, it sort of stays in place a little bit more. And so using the exact right amount of water and pigment becomes critical. And that can be a huge struggle, especially when you're first starting out with watercolor. It's one of the reasons I think a lot of beginner watercolorists get frustrated, because we often use this more affordable paper when we first start out, and we're already faced with two really big struggles. And my third biggest struggle, and this kind of relates to number two as well, but the paint does sit in place. And so when I'm trying to create lots of flowy textures and blends, it's a much harder challenge because the paint isn't moving as far across the paper. It has nothing to do with the quality of the paint or the binder or even the pigments. It's all about the vapor. So you might be wondering now, why on earth would I use such paper if I already know about these challenges? Well, I'm going to talk about some of the reasons I like this paper, and it's because of those very challenges. And a lot of this came from a ton of repetition and using this paper for many, many years. I figured out how to utilize something that might normally be a challenge to my benefit. So, number one, when I was talking about how the paint doesn't quite sink into the paper, especially with big wet washes, and it takes a lot more nuance to get it to spread evenly and flow the way I want it to, I often use that as a way to make very moody, stormy skies. So I can get the paper wet, put the pigment in, and tilt the paper, let it flow and bleed. And I can take advantage of the fact that it tends to dry a little quicker and the paint doesn't spread as much or as evenly. And I can often get really interesting atmospheric effects, especially when doing misty, moody skies. Secondly, when I was talking about how the paint sort of sits in place and might be a little bit streaky, I actually like to utilize that characteristic as a way to draw with the paint. I love drawing and I love making really graphic marks and really allowing the brush strokes to show through in the end. So I can draw tree lines and the edges of the fields and the different areas of the landscape, and the paint will sort of sit in place, and in a way it just looks more illustrative to me. It looks a little bit more graphic, and it's something that I love about it. So when I'm feeling like being very stylized with my mark making, I often use cellulose paper instead. Another benefit to this type of paper is using salt to make interesting textures. So yes, you can use that on cotton paper, but I find it a lot easier on this type of paper because the paint doesn't like sink down into the paper as deep or into the fibers as deeply. It sort of sits on top a little bit more. The salt reacts with the paint really well, so you can create absolutely gorgeous textures really easily. I often find that with 100% cotton paper, if I wait too long to apply the salt, or if I use too much water, or I don't know, like it just is a lot more nuanced than it is on this paper where I can just paint and then drop the salt in and I'm guaranteed to get that really cool effect. But once again, I think that just goes to show that if you use a paper long enough, you'll find ways to use it to your advantage. And finally, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but one of the great things about this type of paper is that it dries fast. With my 100% cotton paper, it takes so long, so long to fully dry because I often use really big wet washes. And I love to layer my landscapes. I like to layer different effects, different elements in the landscape, and that becomes a lot easier when it dries quick, especially when I'm painting outside in the elements. Here in Scotland, it's often extremely humid, and sometimes my paper takes just way too long to dry to finish my second or third layer, so I have to just stop and finish it at home. But when I use my cellulose paper outside, it's a lot easier to finish an entire painting on the spot very quickly and move on to the next spot. So while I absolutely love the effects I can create on 100% cotton paper, I definitely see some advantages to using this type of paper. And I really want to encourage you all to not give up on it. And if you're new to watercolor, just keep going and playing, and you will definitely find ways to use the paper to your advantage.
So there we have it. Here's the final result. You can kind of get a sense of scale when I hold it like this, I think. So I hope that this video inspires you to use whatever paper you have lying around, in addition to saving up for some of the nicer 100% cotton paper. Each of us has to make a decision about how we spend our money, and I know for me, using 100% cotton paper has a ton of benefits, and it's usually what I go for when I'm doing watercolor. But that doesn't mean that I only create my good pieces on the expensive paper. Because it's winter here and it's always dark and cold outside, I am doing a ton of painting in the studio, and I'm actually going through my paper pretty quick. I'm kind of on a mission to use up all of my paper that I already own before buying new paper, including all of these old blocks of paper that I have lying around. So I hope this video inspires you to use whatever you have lying around at home, or at least makes you think a little bit differently about some of the more affordable cellulose papers. I also want to mention that there are a few different art websites like Jackson's that sell sample packs of paper, so you can try a bunch of different brands and different styles of paper before investing in like a big pack of it. Once you start using some of the more expensive 100% cotton papers, you do realize how much of a difference it makes, but it doesn't mean that the more affordable stuff isn't good. I like to approach them in totally different mindsets, so today's video is all about that. I really hope this video inspires you to just use whatever you have lying around at home already. Maybe drop a comment letting everyone know if you found a really nice non 100% cotton paper, so like a cellulose paper, a more affordable paper that you think performs really well. I mean, I have the ones that I lean towards, but I'm always interested to hear what's out there because there's always something that I don't know about yet. All right, that's it for me. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your year. I'll see you in 2024. Cheers.